Okay. So you mentioned Nero. So I'd like to segue to my next question. This is kind of a long question,
Sure.
but some people have commented. This actually refers to someone who commented in one of my videos, a Christian who commented. So many Christians refer to Tacitus's work, Annals, when supporting their view that Christianity actually existed before the Flavians, despite the fact that it was written after the Flavians, most likely during the reign of Trajan. So, who are these Christians that Tacitus is referring to who were blamed by Nero for the fire in Rome? Who exactly are these Christians?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and it comes up almost every time I do an interview with like a Christian scholar. They always bring up the Tacitus quote, and the it's kind of a long answer, but the first part of it is just that. Look, my theory, the idea is that this quote is somehow damaging to my interpretation, and I always say, look, irrespective of the kind of literary analysis, which is just QED, this just demonstrates the connection. I don't need to go any further than this. Irrespective of that, you have the understanding it produces that the Gospels and the story of Jesus are basically a false history that the Flavians produced to create the understanding that a character named Jesus Christ, existed and basically had this weird ministry, which was kind of foresaw their ministry, their war in Judea. Okay, so that's just the general sort of historical understanding that my work produces, is that it's the Flavian court producing a false history. Well, who is Tacitus? I mean, he is the Flavian court historian. That's who he is.
Mm-hmm.
So why would, under my theory, it be, kind of not acceptable that another Flavian court historian produced something that supported this idea of the false history of Jesus Christ? I mean, in fact, it isn't in contradiction to my theory. It is the theory itself. It's just that and it wasn't just Tacitus, but Suetonio and Dio. They all kind of uh, mentioned, I mean, for one thing, that Vespasian and Titus were divine people and that the war had been foreseen by the Jewish prophecies. And Tacitus has that quote about the Christians, who attempted to burn Rome. Well, first of all, I mean, it isn't in contradiction to my theory, because Tacitus is just another Flavian court historian. He's on the payroll. He's producing a false history for the purpose of, creating context and believability for the Gospels. It's as simple as that. If in fact the quote is even legitimate, which I think it probably is actually, but in any case, it isn't something that is would undermine the analysis I do of the connection between Josephus and the Gospels. But so you have Tacitus's mention of the Christians. Well, if this was a historical event, and I imagine it was,
Mm-hmm.
the Christians who would have been attempting to burn Rome during the period of the of Nero's reign, they would have been the Christians, in other words, the follower of a Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
who rebelled against Rome. They wouldn't have been the turn the other cheek, give to Caesar what is Caesar's
Mm-hmm.
Christians that the Gospels promotes and produces. They would have been the other Christians, the real Messianic movement of Palestine, which was xenophobic and would have engaged in terrorist activities. It's completely obvious that it wasn't. If this was Christians, if Tacitus is referring to a real historical event, it wouldn't have been the Jesus Christ followers who would have burned Rome. It would have been the followers of the Messiah that are described in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the xenophobic and warlike Christians. Because remember, the term Christians can be applied to any group basically who's following someone who can claim lineage to the concept of David as David produced it way back when. So anyway, this is the Tacitus quote. It's Roman court historian propaganda, and it probably is part of the kind of transmogrification of history that the Flavians engaged in. And to understand Tacitus' quote, I would point out how the character Peter is treated at the end of the Gospels, where this is a real rebel. Peter, his history is being deformed, really, by the authors of the Gospel to plug him into this pacifistic religion. But what they're doing is they're taking the real history of the Jewish rebels who rebelled against Rome, who were messianic, and then falsifying it and putting it into the Gospels, so that the character Simon is basically developed from a real historical character. And I would say that Tacitus is doing exactly the same thing. He is basically trying to plug history in to Christianity, to the Roman Christianity, with the idea of somehow giving it like a historical, foundation that seems plausible. So that would be how I would handle the Tacitus quote. It's interesting. I think it probably is legit, and I think it's just more Flavian court propaganda.